The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
The question is, what do we mean by reparations? I mean, it seems to me a lot of people mean a lot of different things. To my mind, it means that we have to deal with the fact that there is enormous disparity between the black community and the white community, and that issue has got to be addressed. And I've indicated to you some of the ways that I think it should be addressed.
Well, I think they mean some type of economic empowerment to the African descendants of slaves.
But what does that mean, economic empowerment? I just talked about the fact that I would do my best to change the banking system to make sure that we end racism, that we pay attention to distressed communities, that people get the loans they need to make the investments they need.
What about straight cash payouts?
No.
How much you want,
You agree
Charlamagne?
with that? Why don't you agree with that?
Well, first of all, you mean just a check to every African American?
Yes.
Well, then there's a check to every Native American who were nearly wiped out when the settlers first came here. I think the way we go forward is to build America together. There are distressed communities, white communities. There are distressed Latino communities. Right now, what you have is a government owned and controlled by big money interests who worries about Wall Street and the drug companies. We're going to change that. And we're going to pay attention to the needs of working families and low-income families in this country in a way that you have never.
This is 2016 all over again. You were just listening to Bernie Sanders on The Breakfast Club. There's several clips of Bernie Sanders recently saying that he's opposed to reparations, and this seems to be the standard trap that is easily set for him because he holds the line at reparations. And so there's a lot to talk about here. But let me just reiterate, this is 2016 all over again. We had this conversation. Matter of fact, I remember giving a rebuttal to Ta-Nehisi Coates and his article that he wrote about this very subject in 2016 when Bernie Sanders said in 2016 that he was opposed to reparations. And I did a rebuttal to his rebuttal. But the fundamental argument that Ta-Nehisi Coates had against Bernie Sanders is the same argument that was sampled by Julian Castro. And the same argument that I actually agreed with in 2016. And if you want to go back to the clip, I'll find the link. But in 2016, I could not disagree with what Ta-Nehisi Coates said in response to Bernie Sanders, the big dreamer. Bernie Sanders, who dreams big on everything and is not afraid to push the Overton window to the left on just about any subject except reparations. And for Bernie Sanders to be this dreamer, for Bernie Sanders to be the person who's willing to stand outside of the American discourse and shout at the top of his lungs until everyone else catches up with him, for him to all of a sudden to be extremely pragmatic and sober with regards to the reality of actually implementing reparations in America is extremely disheartening. And I, for one, don't understand why in 2020, now or 2019, Bernie Sanders supporters still don't understand that this is a problem. This is a problem. It's not a problem by virtue of someone being better than Bernie Sanders. Like Julian Castro, like he literally, I'm going to play both clips, Julian Castro, and I'm going to play Ta-Nehisi Coates in 2016, and you'll see that he literally takes Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument from 2016 and just recycles it in 2019, which is why I said this is 2016 all over again. So it's not about Julian Castro being better on race than Bernie Sanders. It's about the fact that Bernie Sanders is stubborn when it comes to reparations, when he has always been outside of the Overton window, always on the edge of what's acceptable, yelling at the top of his lungs, and rightfully so, saying that this is what we need to do. And the only place where his imagination stops is when it comes to reparations. Okay, so before I get into that, I want to underscore the fact that this is not about any other candidate being better than Bernie Sanders with regard to race. It's about the fact that Bernie Sanders refuses to progress on race. He's falling into the same trap in 2019 as he did in 2016. And all the opposition has done is refined their attack on him. So what does that say? For a lot of people that says, oh, well, we should just not even talk about reparations. Really? that's the play, because that's exactly what the likes of Ben Shapiro, who wrote about this, actually agrees with you on. And not that he can't be right about anything, but he's not right about anything. But I digress. Here is Julian Castro this weekend with Jake Tapper. And then immediately after, I'm going to play Ta-Nehisi Coates from Chris Hayes in 2016 so that you can see that Julian Castro, it's not about him being better than Bernie Sanders. He's just simply recycling a very good and valid argument that Ta-Nehisi Coates had already made in 2016 rather.
Let me just say something about Senator Sanders' response there, because he was also asked this question in 2016. Mm-hmm. What he said on The View, I think, the other day was that he didn't think the best way to address this was for the United States to write a check. To my mind, that may or may not be the best way to address it. However, it's interesting to me that when it comes to Medicare for all, health care, the response there has been, we need to write a big check. That when it comes to tuition-free or debt-free college, the answer has been, we need to write a big check. And so if the issue is compensating the descendants of slaves, I don't think that the argument about writing a big check ought to be the argument that you make if you're making an argument that a big check needs to be written for a whole bunch of other stuff.
Interesting.
So if under the Constitution we compensate people because we take their property, why wouldn't you compensate people who actually were property?
Okay, so that's Julian Castro. I'm getting ready to play Ta-Nehisi Coates from Chris Hayes in 2016 so that you can see. And I'm not trying to slam Julian Castro so much as to say this is 2016 all over again. And if you had this problem in 2016, why then were you not prepared to head this off in 2019? And why then is his imagination, Bernie Sanders' imagination, no broader, or rather still constrained when it comes to reparations? When he was bold enough to dream about Medicare for all. He was bold enough to dream about a single payer system. He was bold enough to dream about free tuition for universities and colleges. He's bold enough to dream about all these things. He might even be bold enough to dream about universal basic income, but he's not bold enough to dream about reparations. Here's Ta-Nehisi Coates in 2016.
Well, I simply didn't understand his answer. I mean, to be blunt, the senator, whose campaign I respect, who I've considered very, very courageous, who some people in my household that are a lot younger than me actually support and have been very vocal about supporting, I think has inspired quite a number of people with his willingness to put solutions on the table that, a lot of folks consider outside of the politically doable. And so then to see him dismiss reparations simply because, it is not politically doable in his opinion, it just felt completely off. It felt out of tune with the entire, spirit of his campaign. He mentioned that the chances for getting reparations through Congress are nil. In fact, the senator advocates several things, whose chances in Congress are also nil. I'm not saying he shouldn't be advocating those things, by the way. My point is that he should. You need those ideas out into the world. That should be part of the political debate. I'm a fan of that, but I'm a fan of doing it across the board and not being selective about it.
And the logic is sound. The logic is sound. Now, the conversation went a little further. I'm not going to play all that. I will discuss what Chris Hayes responded to Ta-Nehisi Coates with, which itself is problematic. We'll get there. But just at face value, the logic is sound. Here is a guy whose entire existence in the American political discourse has been to reset the Overton window further to the left than it's ever been in any of our lives, or even in his life for the most part. Bernie's a little old, so I don't know exactly what year he was born, but chances are he was alive during. Anyway, so here's a guy whose entire adult life has been to step outside of the Overton window and say, come America, this is where you should be. And the only place he has a blind spot, the only place he's afraid, or the only place where he's willing to play the game of pragmatism is with regard to reparations. Now, reparations is all the rave over the weekend. And sure, guys, I know people are going to comment, well, Ben, this is just the establishment attempting to sandbag Bernie Sanders because they want to, they know he's doing good in the black community and they want to put a wedge there. Well, that's what politicians do. That's what politics is. And we knew this attack was coming. I've got an entire video on it from 2016. And the only irritation that you're hearing in my voice right now, it's exasperation at the fact that we have not learned anything since 2016. And the reason we, as supporters of Bernie Sanders, have not learned anything is because Bernie Sanders has not learned anything, and he's holding on to his stubborn approach towards reparations when he had the opportunity. No. He's holding on to his stubborn approach towards reparations when he has the biggest imagination with regard to other things that were not politically pragmatic just 2 years ago. So this has nothing to do, and people, please stop doing special pleading for Bernie. Yes, we know this is a political sandbagging that's happening by the establishment to undermine Bernie Sanders. Yes, but answer me this. Setting that aside, why is Bernie Sanders no better in 2019 than he was in 2016 with regard to reparations? I've even seen I've seen some black people who want to be the best Bernie buddies possible who have just kind of said, oh, well, we don't really need reparations like that. Really? Out of all the examples in American history where reparations have been paid, now you're willing to set aside the standard demand that America owes American descendants of slaves? And I don't mean ADOS. I'm just talking about people who descended from slaves. You're gonna relinquish the claims towards what America owes us in order to support Bernie Sanders? Yeah, I'll let you guys can certainly have that position. That is not a position for me. But it's infuriating that no progress has been made and his imagination with regard to race has not expanded whatsoever. And he's constrained. And he's constrained by some of the same blind spots that he's had, for as long as I've known him. And I'm still supporting him, still going to vote for him. Obviously in the primaries. I mean, unless somebody magical comes along that I've never heard of that's just like the most amazing leftist. I mean, it's okay to criticize people we support. In fact, it's extremely healthy to criticize them and to critique them, especially when they're wrong. And the case that Julian Castro sampled Ta-Nehisi Coates, it's not Julian Castro's argument, it's Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? The case that Ta-Nehisi Coates made against Bernie Sanders was so solid in 2016, it's still solid now, that I agreed with him in 2016. The only thing I said, which actually, a kind of a proud moment, Ta-Nehisi Coates, when he was on Twitter, he actually alley-ooped my video. Somebody asked him, they were like, well, what do you think is a viable critique of your critique of Bernie Sanders? They asked Ta-Nehisi Coates this, and he shared my video in which I said, I can't argue with the logic that Coates is forwarding, but I'm just tired of people making Bernie Sanders have to jump through hoops that they don't make anyone else jump through. That's my number one beef. That's my beef right now, right? But the problem is a little different. So my problem in 2016 was that you guys are making Bernie Sanders jump through hoops that you're not making Hillary Clinton jump through, because we know Hillary Clinton does not support reparations, right? It was easy in 2016 to undercut that argument. You know, if you wanted to not make a case of special pleading, and you didn't want to, sacrifice what you believed as a black person America owes you just in order for you to support Bernie Sanders, the logical positioning to hold in 2016 was, well, Hillary Clinton doesn't support it, and furthermore, you guys don't even ask her about it. And so you guys are making Bernie Sanders go through machinations that no one else has to go through. And I think I phrased it, and, this is only for black people to repeat. I phrased it as, stop making him jump through Negro hoops. Right? That you're not making other people jump through. But whereas the political establishment adjusted, I can't say they adjusted to my argument because maybe 5 important people or 5 establishment people actually listened to the video that Ta-Nehisi Coates retweeted of mine. Maybe. But they sit around all day long thinking about how they can outmaneuver their opposition. And can I put another pin here? When I talk about things, very rarely do I talk about them from my personal passion and my personal stake in it. Where I'm personally passionate, however, is politics, real politics. Especially in domestic politics in particular. Like, you gotta understand the games that are being played around you. And the political establishment sits around in their think tanks, Center for American Progress, which is a misnomer, and they calculate what is the best positioning for us to hold in 2020 in order to hold back Bernie Sanders. And you know what? Instead of them having to just be mum about reparations and only ask Bernie Sanders about reparations like they did in 2016, they rolled out people who now are supportive of reparations, even if it's just kind of smoke and mirrors like Julian Castro, who said he's going to appoint a commission in order to explore it. Man, come on, man. That's. But he rolled out Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument. And he wrote it out, pretty succinctly. And now he gives the appearance that he supports reparations when Bernie Sanders is a firm no. That, my friends, is political evolution, even if it's for political expediency, because you have to be politically expedient at times in order to win. It's just, so I only went through that because I want you to understand, we can get into the sincerity of the arguments of whether or not I really believe, and I do believe that the American government owes black people. Absolutely. But I don't even have to argue this on the merits of the case for reparations. I'll argue it from the fact that so many people are keyed in with Bernie Sanders that they refuse to criticize him or critique him when he's not only wrong on the merits, not only wrong on the principle of the thing, but he's also wrong in terms of politics. The political establishment is outmaneuvering and outflanking Bernie Sanders, and it will cause a wedge in the black community. You even had David Brooks write an article in the New York Times, The Case for Reparations, where he basically said, I've come around to Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations that he wrote 5 years ago, and now I support reparations. Really? Okay, so on the merits of it, you should have been supporting it all along, but I get it. You're Johnny-come-lately. But politically speaking, this is just another chess move by the political establishment to undermine the position of Bernie Sanders. That's number 2. But number 3, an opportunity for us to hold the American government to the fire, which might be wishful thinking, but isn't that what all this is? Just a few years, 2 years ago, single payer Medicare for all was wishful thinking. And so it's almost like when people come around to what you've been wanting all along, you just don't want it from the people who came around with it. People finally came around. Kamala Harris came around a couple years ago. Forget about her backtracking now, but a couple years ago, Kamala Harris came around to the idea for Medicare for all, and then all of a sudden people are like, no, I don't really know if I want. Just take the win. Just take the win. And in this case, if the political establishment is punt faking, right? Because we know they're not serious about it. But it's still an opportunity to move the national discourse in the right direction, which is far more powerful than anything else. And Bernie Sanders knows that. He knows just the sheer ability to move the discourse in the right direction is one of the most powerful political tools we have at our disposal. And while the political establishment is disingenuously outflanking Bernie Sanders with regard to reparations, and they're doing it only for political expediency, to divide the black vote away from Bernie Sanders. They have moved in the right direction on an issue, and we could seize it to actually address hundreds of years of the impact of slavery on the lives of black folks in this country. But yet, my friend Bernie Sanders, who I support, is still like, no, I'm good. I'm good on reparations. Because, if we get a classless society, then racism can't exist. Or at least, that's what Ben Shapiro interpreted. I want to read you a little bit of Ben Shapiro's piece. We'll take a quick break. So, I know this is a logical fallacy, but if you're on the same side as Ben Shapiro on an issue, you might want to pause and reflect about your life. This is what Ben Shapiro wrote over the weekend or last week, The Righteous Mission of Bernie Sanders. And he said, quote, Sanders is currently being excoriated by a radical segment of the Democratic Party for his racial views, despite the fact that Sanders marched with Dr. King during the Civil Rights Movement, as if that just absolves Bernie Sanders of anything he ever could do wrong. I digress. Despite the fact that Sanders marched with Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement, he is now viewed as a retrograde in his racial viewpoints. That's because he believes that socialism is a cure-all for racial discrimination. For example, Sanders refuses to endorse racial reparations, stating instead that broad-based governmental programs ought to benefit those who are lowest on the income ladder. He has likewise stated that candidates ought to be judged based on their ideas rather than their intersectional characteristics. In 2016, Sanders stated, one of the struggles that you're going to see in the Democratic Party is whether to go beyond identity politics. There it is. Identity politics. The anathema for Republicans, clearly, conservatives, absolutely, and a whole swath of the Democratic Party. But surprise, surprise, it's also an anathema for many people on the progressive left. Because they view, just like Bernie Sanders, that the solution isn't racially specific. The solution is, something that we can address with broad-based governmental programs. But the crime was racially specific. The injury was racially specific, and the ravages of slavery can still be seen and felt today. However, they don't feel like the solution is racially specific. See, and that's the problem I have with Bernie. That's the problem I have with Bernie supporters, of which I consider myself one. I will be voting for Bernie. I've supported Bernie for quite some time, and I've had the same issue with Bernie that I have right now, is the fact that when it comes to race, he is afraid of being racially specific in his solutions, never mind the fact that the injury, the original sin, was very much racially specific. And I have no need or desire to change my argument in order to maintain my support for Bernie Sanders. I'm just not going to engage in the cult of personality in which I can't possibly criticize him. That's not how this works. And in fact, had the criticism actually resonated with Sanders, if he wasn't such a stubborn ass, which he is, come on, you guys know he's stubborn. If he wasn't stubborn, he would have paused and understood the shifting paradigm he would not even the shifting paradigm. He would have understood the game that's going to be played against him in 2020, that's being played against him right now, where the establishment is punt faking. Not pump faking. I keep saying pump faking. I mean head faking. They're head faking as though they intend to go in this direction, but they have absolutely no real intention of going in that direction. But they know if they head fake, then they could change the entire conversation to make it look as though Bernie Sanders is the problem. And my problem with Bernie Sanders is that he looks at this and does not budge, which is political malpractice, number one. Number two, it's an issue that he needs to grow on, because if he has the political imagination to push the entire country towards socialism when nobody else was thinking about socialism, when socialism was a dirty word, he had the political courage to stand outside of the Overton window and shout until America caught up with him, yet he does not have the political imagination to do the same for reparations. So not only is he committing political malpractice, but he's wrong based on his own principle of radicalism. And he's also wrong on the merits, because this was a racially specific crime against black people. And so there should therefore be a racially specific solution. But Ben Shapiro supports him on this. He supports him on race, right? Because, above all else, we got to not ever give in to identity politics, as though individual identities don't have very specific grievances that were based and predicated on those identities. It's not as though they enslaved black people just cause. It's not as though they enslaved everybody. They enslaved Africans. So, number one, it's political malpractice to not be ahead of the chess move that's being made by the political establishment that is more than willing to head fake and give the illusion as though they are willing to support reparations, when Julian Castro, when you unpack it, he's really just talking about putting forth a commission to explore the possibility of reparations, right? So it's a head fake, but Bernie Sanders is committing political malpractice through his stubbornness by not being ahead of that. Because what does it cost him? What does it cost him to support reparations? That is the real question. And that is the question that Chris Hayes actually explored with Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm not going to play the clip because MSNBC is they're draconian with their copyright infringement. But he explored it with Ta-Nehisi Coates 2 years ago. And this was his conclusion. He said the argument really could be that the reason that Bernie Sanders will not support reparations is because the big tent of the Democratic Party is tenuous at best and could very well break if a politician came out in favor of reparations. And to that, Ta-Nehisi Coates said, well, then make that argument, make that case. That might be a good argument to make. And Chris Hayes, and that seems to be the general consensus. I think even Ben Shapiro referenced that somewhat in his article, or his little blurb. It was 500 words. And that's an argument that so many people make. That's an argument that I see black people making right now, that there's no way a politician could win if they support reparations. Because of some of those underlying conditions, there's a big swath of the Democratic Party that are just so opposed to identity politics that if somebody had the nerve to support reparations, then there's no chance that they could win. So it is politically expedient, in fact, for Bernie Sanders to not support reparations. Which then tells me, number one, y'all ain't paying attention. You're not paying attention to the changing landscape right now. You're not. You're arguing something that was, it's almost like Brer Rabbit in reverse. Like you're arguing for two things: positions that were held in 2016 in which the political establishment is head faking and giving the appearance, that they support reparations, which is actually an open door for us to push the Overton window in that direction. So even if there's so many Democrats who are just Dixiecrats underneath and they would never support reparations, well, hell, isn't this the opportune time to call their bluff? Call the establishment's bluff and say, fine, let's talk about reparations. So I don't buy that argument, especially in terms of political expediency, because once the political establishment makes that head fake, you seize upon that and you run the distance on this thing. You run up the scoreboard on this thing. And you push that Overton window in that direction. So I don't support that argument that, it's just politically inexpedient and it's political suicide. No. Talking about single payer Medicare for all back in 1989, that was political suicide. But I digress. The other part about this that irritates the hell out of me is that we are okay with allowing people who benefit from our votes to simultaneously tell us what we ain't gonna do for you based on your identity, or whether we shouldn't even talk about your identity. And this is not just the Democratic Party. This is also leftist. This is also progressive, socialist, communist. You find this in all sorts of all parts of America's psyche and political spectrum. You find this everywhere, where people are trying to push aside our identities because for whatever reason, they aren't comfortable talking about it and they don't feel like it's worthwhile talking about as a political issue when the harm was very specific and specified based upon our identities. So I have a problem with us being okay with that problem. If I'm making any sense, which I know I am, stay with me. What I'm saying is, if you feel that the problem that exists in the Democratic Party and leftist circles in this country is such that we can't talk about identity and no one can really go and support reparations, or else they would break this big tent, this coalition would fall apart, then the problem isn't reparations. The problem is that you're okay with this big swath of of people who call themselves our allies and essentially being racist. Or if that's too harsh for you and that's just too big of a jump, being uncomfortable addressing the problem of systemic racism and the ravages of slavery in this country. And when we talk about those things, then they are willing to blow up the coalition from which they benefit from our votes on a regular basis. That's the real problem with that argument, is that for you to accept that argument, then you're accepting that they do not want to talk about the issues that are most important to us. And the only way that this tent and this coalition can exist is if we, who have racially specific, identity specific grievances, are silent about those grievances. I'm done. See you tomorrow.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.